Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Well, this week I'm going to go back to the Middle East and the war in Gaza. It's still by far the dominant international story. Now, I'm not going to sort of take you through the current news because I'm sure that, like me, you're glued to your TV screens and the nightly news bulletins. What I'd like to do today is take the lens slightly out a little bit and look at the longer-term strategic implications, not just for the Middle East, but for the broader international community of what we've seen thus far in nearly 2 months now of the crisis between Israel and Hamas. First of all, I think there are an enormous number of unanswered questions for which we still don't have even the beginning of an answer, let alone a convincing answer. For example, the humanitarian pause, is it going to continue beyond the extended 2 days? Will it break down because Hamas will ask for more and more Palestinian prisoners to be released in exchange for fewer and fewer Israeli hostages in order to spin out the ceasefire and in order to dominate the agenda and make Israel negotiate with it as much as Israel is trying to fight it? You may recall, dear listeners, that back in 2011, the Israelis released 1,027 Palestinian prisoners for just one Israeli staff sergeant, Gilad Shalit, who was held in Gaza for 5 years. A second issue concerns how to balance the military operations with what Israeli spokesmen declare is their real concern to respect civilian lives and minimize those lives. For example, Israel is now proposing a humanitarian safety zone in the south of Gaza. But how can it possibly bottle up 2.3 million Palestinians who are already bottled up in the broader Gaza into such a small space? They may be protected from bombs and bullets, but would they be protected from disease and dire sanitary conditions? There's, of course, the question of Israel's military objectives. It still speaks about eliminating Hamas, but is that feasible? Is it not more realistic now to have some more modest and achievable objectives, such as wind up the tunnel complex that Hamas has in Gaza, or destroy their missiles, or force their leaders into exile, or whatever, so that it would be more difficult for Hamas to attack Israel, particularly on the scale of what we saw on the 7th of October. Another big question is what's going to be the future of Gaza if Israel does not continue with its military occupation, and it says it will not. Who's going to run the place? Will it be the UN? Will it be an Arab sort of peacekeeping force? Will the Americans, will the Europeans become involved in that? Who is going to feed the 2.3 million Palestinians that nobody else wants, and therefore who will be condemned to stay there? And then finally, there's a lot of talk about the two-state solution as being the lesson of this crisis, the only way forward, the only way to have a durable peace between Palestinians and Israelis. But how do you get to a two-state solution when Israelis have come out of this crisis believing that the Palestinians hate them and don't want to live with them, and that therefore any kind of two-state solution, even if it's desirable, is simply not feasible? Now, there is a broader question that people like me, former diplomats, and now sort of think tankers like to ask, which is, will this conflict be transformative? Will it change the world durably? Or will, once the dust settles, will we just go back to the old paradigm and business as usual? I mean, you can think of some transformative events, can't you? I mean, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, they're obvious ones. But even 9/11 in the United States, which led to the global war on terror, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, or even Putin's invasion of Ukraine, his annexation of Crimea in 2014, which pushed NATO back to collective defense. I'm not quite sure that the Gaza conflict is going to be transformative. At the moment, the Americans seem to have been successful in containing the conflict. Iran has not come in. Israel probably wants to dust has settled, will go back to being divided as it was before between hawks and doves, those who want the total security situation vis-a-vis those who are prepared to negotiate. Probably will have Hamas still out there somehow, or certainly have Hezbollah in Lebanon and the other pro-Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. Israel will still be worried about Iran's developing nuclear program. But even if this conflict is not transformative, what I would like to emphasize today is nonetheless some initial interesting conclusions that I'm seeing, and which I think that Western policymakers need to think deeply about in the weeks ahead. Number one is assumptions. Israel got involved in this crisis because it had assumptions about the behavior of Hamas, that it would be wedded to the status quo, that it wouldn't undertake a military campaign, except for firing the occasional rocket into Israel, that were proven to be wrong. And because Israel had the wrong assumptions, it played down all of the intelligence that indicated that Hamas was preparing something. There was, in fact, on the BBC yesterday evening, an interesting video showing Hamas training for the October the 7th operation in full view, in daylight, just 1 kilometer away in northern Gaza from the border with Israel. Why were those signals not picked up? Because the assumptions were wrong. And therefore, I think the first lesson for policymakers everywhere is let's test our assumptions to make sure that it's the intelligence that is driving the assumptions and not the assumptions that are driving the intelligence. Because if we get them wrong, and we're proven to be wrong, it's often too late to adjust our policies and react before the worst happens. Lesson number two, radicalization. Now, this is a word that was used in every security article 20 years ago in the wake of the global war on terror, when we saw terrorism, particularly jihadist terrorism as the main threat. We haven't really been focused on that recently. Terrorism has moved to Africa or remained in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. We've been more concentrating on great power competition and interstate conflict. But I remember from my generation that the one thing more than anything else that radicalized people and pushed them into violent action was the Arab Israeli-Palestinian dispute, by far. And if the war goes on for a long time and there's more Israeli bombardments and a worsening of the humanitarian situation, we may see a return to generations of young people in Europe and North America and elsewhere being pushed into terrorist or jihadist or extremist groups and being prepared to use violence. These people won't find it as easy to go to a caliphate to join ISIL in Syria or Iraq as they did a decade or so ago. It's not so easy to get to Chad or Mali or Burkina Faso, where these groups now thrive, but they will nonetheless be quite capable and ready to carry out actions at home. And so there is an urgent need to end the conflict in Gaza as quickly as possible, not just as a humanitarian duty, but as a fundamental self-security interest of the democracies. Number three, the rules of war. We know what the rules of war are, but what this Gaza conflict has shown is the very different interpretations that Israel, Hamas, the Arab states, the Palestinians give to the rules of war. For example, to what extent are hospitals protected? Are you allowed to drop 2,000-pound bombs on apartment buildings? Should you give civilians more warning and provide for their evacuation before you attack targets? If you think that you have legitimate self-defense, how far are you able to go with that? Do the rights of individuals come before the security interests of whole states? I could go on. So what we need to do after this conflict is have an urgent sort of review, not of what the rules are, the Geneva Conventions, but how they are to be interpreted very, very precisely. The next issue is deterrence. The Israelis, of course, experienced a breakdown of deterrence on October the 7th. They thought that they had everything in place to contain Hamas, and that Hamas would not fight Israel if the Israeli response would destroy Hamas, who would commit suicide. But clearly this has not worked. Hamas has decided that the short-term risks of having massive casualties is worth the long-term benefit of emerging as the leader of the Palestinian cause, vis-a-vis Fatah and vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority. That at the end of the day, they will come out of this stronger rather than weaker. And if we look at Putin and Ukraine, we see also that the West believed that the threat of economic sanctions would deter Russia. They didn't. Or we believe that the pain that Russia has suffered as a result of sanctions would force it to negotiate and withdraw from Ukraine. It hasn't. So we need to make sure that we really understand whether our adversaries calculate the effect of deterrence in the same way that we do as well. And finally, the new economic order. It's an interesting mix what we're seeing. On the one hand, the old is still there. The United States is still the indispensable nation, the one country that can really get a truce done, can get the Israelis to agree to humanitarian aid, can form both a coalition with Arab states while nudging Israel towards greater moderation. The United States is still, to quote Madeleine Albright, the indispensable nation, and the EU continues to be plagued by the same divisions and the lack of political leverage commensurate with its economic aid that we've seen for a long time. So what's new? But we're also seeing China offering to mediate. We're seeing the greater role of the Arab states forming negotiating teams and getting involved. We're seeing a small country like Qatar play an outside role in negotiating the hostage release. We're seeing the BRICS meeting. We're seeing the Organization of Islamic Cooperation meeting, the Arab League meeting, ASEAN in Asia meeting. So in a way, we're seeing the new multilateral order where the old states still matter, but only to the extent that they can increasingly work with all of these new partners harmoniously. It's an interesting thing. So that's where I stop for today. The war in Gaza, tragically, is not yet over, but already there is a lot of meat for we in the strategic community to be thinking about if we want to come out of this with more security rather than less. Thank you for listening today. Look forward, as always, to engaging with you soon. Take good care and bye from Brussels for now.